Breaking news now. Protesters in New York City have found a new favorite address, and they are occupying not just the streets outside, which you can see this is a chopper shot that we cannot take control over. So we wish that this helicopter would pull out, because you'll see people at the top of the screen beyond our banners. There are many of them. Some of them have made their way into occupying the lobby at Trump Tower. This is in protest of the arrest and detainment of Mahmoud Khalil. Remember, he is a graduate student who was on the campus of Columbia University professing hate. We know that he was a very high-profile face along with groups on that campus who are pro-Hamas on Columbia. And when ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, picked him up, the protesting began. Now, some of it has not looked like protected speech or protests. It's looked more violent than that, as people have pressed physically against NYPD officers in this city. Let's watch the video now. This is what happened inside. And can you hear them chanting? Listen carefully as we go to that. Free Mahmoud, free them all.
Free Mahmoud, free them all. Free Mahmoud, free them all. Free Mahmoud, free them all.
So you hear them chanting, free Mahmoud, free them all. I'm wondering, Ari, who are they all? And if the world is watching our nation right now, and they know us as you know, a bastion of free speech, so on and so forth, when you hate, when people feel under threat because of what you're saying, that's actually not protected speech.
That's right.
And look at some of the signage in here. I mean, they hate Israel, they hate Jewish Americans, they are anti-American.
I'll make two big points here. One, I'm going to start with the speech facade, the myth that this is about speech. What happened to Mahmoud Khalil had nothing to do with speech. It has everything to do with creating an encampment that is where Zionists are prohibited, where Jewish students are not allowed to walk on their own campus. These are crimes. These are deportable events. These are things that we would never tolerate. As for all these people who are now in Trump Tower, I hope that this administration will do what the Biden administration did to the January 6 people who walked inside the Capitol. They have the technology, get their faces, match it up with the database, and if any of them are non-citizens, every one of them is trespassing. They all should be deported from this country, too.
But wouldn't they be trespassing anyway if they are causing people to fear? There are people who pay to live in that residence. There are businesses on that floor of the lobby. This is not a safe situation. If you are Jewish in that building, do you feel safe?
Well, whether you feel safe, don't feel safe, whatever the legal remedy is to give the State Department under Marco Rubio's leadership, who took action against Mahmoud Khalil,
at a federal level,
any of these people are not citizens, they should be deported. We have to have a new way of approaching this. The streets of New York have got to stop getting shut down on a regular basis, interfering with ambulances and fire departments and people trying to get to their jobs. We don't have to have mayhem in our streets because these people, the face of the Democrat Party, are pro-Hamas.
Well, and this looks like, Lisa, this looks like what we saw in Columbia University last year with the tents. Those T-shirts were printed. Come on, this is not an accident that people with identical T-shirts show up at Trump Tower and then they occupy the lobby. I mean, coincidence is interesting. It's just usually not applicable.
Well, yeah, I mean, they hate Israel, obviously, in the West. But I think it's hilarious that they believe this is going to have any impact on President Trump, a guy who survived an assassination attempt and then took the stage at the Republican National Convention just days later. So this is going to have zero impact on him. He's not swayed at all. So you're wasting your time, people out in the streets. But look at who the left makes their heroes, right? This guy.
Yes.
Hamas, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, a guy who pulled a knife on a police officer. So they have some strange heroes. And then look who they won't stand up for when you look at President Trump's speech to Congress, a 13-year-old with cancer, Laken Riley, right? So this tells you everything about their values, and they're totally misaligned with the rest of America.
Look, there was a representative we had on the show last week, Representative Gooden of Texas, and he was the person who ripped the sign out that said this is not normal as President Trump was walking into that joint congressional address. And he said, look, when you've had enough, you've just had enough. So America has had enough. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Trump have had enough. Will the Democrats ever have enough of this kind of hate?
Yeah, I watched a video of one of Mahmoud Khalil's. I mean, he has like a dozen attorneys.
It's a lot.
Appeared to be an attorney saying that the wife said, my husband was kidnapped. Okay, the American government does not kidnap people, first of all. Your husband is getting his student visa taken away. And you mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said, this is not about free speech. Nobody has a right to a student visa. Nobody has a right to a green card. And that is exactly right. You put the statute on your show, Harris, the Immigration and Nationality Act, I believe it was yesterday. If you are suspected of articulating a viewpoint or pushing forward or helping a terrorist group, there are different nuances with the exact wording. You can get your visa yanked away. And by the way, the Supreme Court is very friendly to arguments about national security as it pertains to the federal government.
Excellent point.
It is their purview.
Section 237A4C of the Immigration and Nationality Act, if you should want to look it up. I try to read it out loud every day.
By the way, he wasn't kidnapped. He's getting a free flight to Syria. He shouldn't have complained.
Well, I mean, he was
Born in Syria.
born there. Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Look, Emily, as we look at this, though, and read those signs. Fight Nazis, not students. So does that make the rest of us in America Nazis? What are they even doing right now?
Well, I just point out, too, how tragically misguided this is in terms as well of that coverage and amplification. So they are saying free Mahmoud. What about free Adon Alexander, who was the United States American hostage who is still in the clutches of Hamas? How about freeing the remains of the 4 additional American bodies that are there? The urgency, the intensity, and the congealed nature of this, the fervor. I wish there would just be an iota of that would get even more coverage of the Americans that are still there. And I've been trying to read what their T-shirts say. And on the back it says, Jews say stop. I can't read the bottom too, but there have been shirts out there that say stop arming Israel. And I know that there are plenty of printed that in these similar protests that say Jews say stop arming Israel. To your point about the signs that say fight Nazis, not students, what about fight Hamas?
Yeah.
I mean,
they're not going to do that.
The whole reality, and this goes back to our, by the way, our A-block discussion of the Democratic Party, because Rahm Emanuel purposefully did not go to any Ivy League campus as he's going out there and talking about this, right? These are bastion and fomenting grounds for this kind of ideology, patently unacceptable, and those people are trespassing.
Yeah, but this is personal now. That's Trump Tower. That bears his name. Think about all the people who've gone after Trump, not just as president, but previously. All the lawfare against him. Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state, the governor, Kathy Hochul. Think about the people who have gone after him. This is his tower bearing his name. They would love it if his name were not on anything in the city. That's what the district attorney and AG and the state of New York and New York City were trying to do. They couldn't win on that. So this is all part of that bigger sort of gestalt view, if you will, of Donald Trump and his leadership in this country from a side that would rather we not have real freedom in this country. Because real freedom isn't just for the people that you like, it's for everybody. There but by the grace of God go any of us if Jewish Americans are afraid when they go to sleep tonight because of the stuff that's happening on the streets of some of our cities. I want to bring in now Eric Shawn. Eric.
Yeah, we're here live on the corner of 57th and 5th. There is Trump Tower. There have been some arrests already of some protesters who were sitting in the heart of the Trump organization, taking their message to President Trump in Washington. It is the group Voice, a Jewish Voice for Peace. They have been demanding that Mahmoud Khalil be freed and not be deported, and they are also been calling for no walls either in Mexico or in the Middle East. As you can see here, some of the protesters are gathered on the side after they voluntarily came out, but we've seen protesters arrested already. The police, NYPD, have their zip ties ready as these protesters, with their message that they've been carrying around New York City in various areas. There is someone being arrested right now, walking backwards, and you hear the cheers. You hear the cheers from the protesters as more arrests are coming out. Those are the people who decided to stay in the lobby, the pink marbled lobby of Trump Tower. as well others are here. Let's just listen to their chant for just a moment.
Palestinians have the right to live in freedom.
Those here have been saying basically that Mahmoud Khalil has been exercising his First Amendment rights and should not be deported. Of course, the Trump administration says that he is aligned with the terrorist group Hamas, and that's why Secretary of State Marco Rubio says under the law, as the Secretary of State, he has the right to deport Mr. Khalil. His wife gave a plaintiff plea saying that her husband only cares about Palestinian people, and he's been fighting for the Palestinian people. So that is the scene right here on Fifth Avenue at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. Let's go in right here to a news conference. Let's listen. Why are you here, ma'am? I'm with Fox.
Don't do that.
Why not? I'm with the news department at Fox. Why not? You're broadcasting to people on the...
Eric, we have lost all of your audio. I know you're walking and you are corded. You are not wireless, I would imagine. So we are losing you. We're losing sound of you and the people around you. We will come back to you, Eric Shawn, if you can hear the sound of my voice as soon as we can. I do want to get to this. So we know that they are making arrests inside that lobby right now. We can't see this. The video that you're seeing right now is from moments ago. So we are not able to contemporaneously show you those arrests. That doesn't mean that there won't be video later, but right now that is playing out. And I would imagine that the shouts that we could hear outside from that group when Eric Shawn lowered his voice so that we could hear the hate on the streets. And yes, they are for Mahmoud Khalil, a man known to lead high-profile protests against Israel, against Jewish Americans, and many of them aligned with pro-Hamas. Okay, they are declared a terrorism organization by President Trump. By the federal government, they are terrorists. And Khalil and others have been in those groups. Now, we can't say exactly who wrote what sign and printed the T-shirts and all of that. I personally want to look into that and see if there are any sorts of connections to what we saw last year. There was a lot of money flowing onto those Ivy League campuses for all those tents. All right, the arrests now. Now we're seeing, this is live. Let's see if we can get the camera up right and straight again. They are taking people out of that lobby now. And Ari, this is exactly what you said needs to happen. And next steps with Ari Fleischer on the couch with us today would be a top-down approach from the Secretary of State, from the federal government. And that section of the Immigration and Nationality Act law, Section 237A4C, that says that Secretary Rubio has found that Khalil's presence and activities in the U.S. would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the U.S. Secretary of State has the latitude to kick anybody out for any reason who's here on a student visa or a green card.
Well, first and foremost, it is utterly distressing that after the October 7th attack, the biggest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, that there is a movement inside the United States that is pro-Hamas. I mean, it is beyond me how any group of Americans, if they're American, or non-citizens can be in this country and be pro-Hamas. And we have to remedy that. And the way you remedy it is to recognize, one, Fifth Avenue is shut down. That's a violation of the law. These people are illegally trespassing inside private property, Trump Tower. Deport them. Use whatever technology we need. This is playing perfectly into the hands of the Rubio and the Trump administration, who says we're not putting up with this. There's a new sheriff in town.
Well, look, sheriffs, deputies, whoever it takes, we want people arrested and for the right thing to be done. And some of that with NYPD police officers. Look to the left of your screen. That is a live look of people being carted out by law enforcement. They are taking them out. Look, if we didn't see enough of that movement on campuses last year, of students being held accountable, this is more of the same. But the difference that has to happen now, Lisa, you can't just let them go in a soft on crime policy district attorney's office. You can't say that we aren't going, because I thought Paul Morrow was here earlier this week or last week, and he said, look, why don't we know details about those cases against the students that basically were holding hostages on one of the campuses because they hate Jews? Like, what? Why not? And that would be my question now. We want to see the details of the cases against these people after they arrest them. Make sure that the penalty is applied to them with the full force of the law.
Yeah, we should deport people who are a threat to our country. Also, there's security concerns here. Why was this allowed to happen? How did this start? And why were so many people allowed to protest in Trump Tower to this degree? So I have concerns about that. But also, these people are so delusional, so dumb. To wear shirts that say fight Nazis, you are supporting the Nazis, you morons. You're supporting Hamas, who committed the largest attack on the Jews, the deadliest attack on the Jews since the Holocaust on October 7th. So these people are just so stupid, so delusional to wear those shirts when they're the ones supporting Nazis.
They're hateful, and now they're being held to account, at least on this day. We'll see what happens further with the law, but they're being arrested, pulled out of the Trump Tower right now. And that, just so you know, Fifth Avenue is one of the places in New York City that is iconic. Tourists go there, and can you imagine now, you can't gain access. All those businesses have to halt what they were doing as they bring out more of these. I don't even call them protesters. They were occupying Trump Tower. By the way, at one point they were chanting the right to live in freedom. The right to live in freedom. What about Jewish Americans? What about everybody on the streets right now of New York City near here on Fifth Avenue? What about people who are watching this? They have a right to live in freedom. Ari?
Yeah, I would like to hear two New York's leaders, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the House, a Democrat from New York City, and Senator Chuck Schumer, also a New Yorker, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. What are they going to say about this? Will they condemn this? Or will they kowtow to the pro-Hamas wing of the Democratic Party? This is what we talked about earlier. All the energy of the Democratic Party, the modern Democratic Party, is from this far left base. It is time for them to condemn this protest and be anti-Hamas.
They won't condemn this. I'm just going to predict that. We've seen them defend Mahmoud Khalil, many people in their party. You know, look at this. This, for people who haven't been to Trump Tower, you see the bike rack, and that's there intentionally. That's there because the President of the United States owns this building. It is a threatened building in many ways. These protesters would have had to have gone through metal detectors. That's at least how it's been for several years. If you went in there to meet with anyone in Trump world, you had to go through a metal detector. So many of these individuals, to Lisa's point, how did they get in? They're wearing masks. We now see them being arrested with zip ties. You know, are they hiding their identity? We know this report came out from Axios that they're using AI technology to identify these people. And they specifically want to know, were any of these people arrested during the Biden administration and not deported? So this mask helps obscure that AI technology. But Harris, that point you made, I picked up on that too, when they said the right to live in freedom. And my head immediately went to kibbutz near Oz, where Yarden and Shiri Bibas were trying to live peacefully with their family, with their 9-month-old Kafir, with their 4-year-old Ariel. They were thinking about moving, according to reports, because it felt unsafe. And instead, Hamas kidnapped them, killed the 2 little babies, killed the wife, and that dad is living alone without his family. They had a right to live in freedom. You spoiled students. Many of you look as if you're students. You're living in freedom. Welcome to the United States of America, where you can peacefully say what you want. But you cannot support terrorism and be here on a student visa. You cannot support the kidnappers of Shiri, of Kafir, of Ariel, and of Yarden. You cannot support them and be here. It's a privilege to be in this country on a student visa. You guys live in freedom. Who doesn't are the people of Israel.
Well, look, I appreciate you taking it back to October 7th because, honestly, Emily, we don't talk about it enough. So this is inside. We'll get back to that point in a moment. This is live inside Trump Tower. So this is playing out on the inside of a building of President Trump's. We don't know if there's anyone that he knows who's home in those residences right now. I mean, that's part of the story that we don't have. But what we know right now is that people are being taken out with NYPD officers escorting them out. Kayleigh mentioned the zip ties. You know, as you see this play out, Emily, this can't just come to a few protesters picked up to stop the melee and they get let go. What can they be held on? What can they be charged with? How tough does the district attorney, what latitude does he have legally here?
Well, just a reminder that in Alvin Bragg's day one memo, he said he wouldn't prosecute, quote, low-level misdemeanor offenses, which includes trespass. He specifically articulated that, unless it was part of a larger felony case. So if we had a district attorney here in Gotham City that actually had a vertebrae, then I would propose that, yes, they would find a constellation of charges, that they would absolutely bake trespass into larger felony cases of, you know, alignment with terrorism and whatever else. I don't care. Pick a ton. But the reality is, I am sure, as we see the massively affable way that these protesters are submitting to the arrest means that there's no way you can tie it to resisting arrest. We've seen them. I mean, it's sort of like watching someone try to lift a mannequin. Like, they're very pliable. So I don't see resisting being any part of this, which is a positive, because obviously the safety and security of our law enforcement is penultimate. Yes. But at the end of the day, the building owner should press charges, right? We know who that is. But I don't know what the DA is going to do. And what this shows me is that all of these individuals who clearly don't have jobs, as they're out there on a Thursday morning enjoying vandalism and breaking and entering and all the things, what I see is the movement around Free Mahmoud should be replaced with a movement of Free Adon. Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.